Senator, before the break, we were talking about this so-called super committee. I think they have to find a way to cut the deficit by 1.5 or is it 1.6 trillion, somewhere in that neighborhood, over a 10-year period, and they've got to do that by November 23rd, or risk triggering 1.2 trillion in cuts across the board in the budget, evenly divided between defense and non-defense spending. First of all, Senator, if that trigger was triggered, what would that do to defense spending?
Well, you think about $600 billion cut in defense after the $350 billion that's already been cut over 10 years. That's around $60 billion a year. That's going to start cutting into some of the muscle. That's just not fat. And that was designed that way to really encourage the super committee to get its work done and to get at least 1.2 trillion. But do you know, Steve, there are 44 of us who have stood up and said, we want the super committee to go big. We want it to go 4 trillion plus deficit reduction over 10 years. Now, you can't do that just with spending cuts. You got to make some major reforms in entitlements. You've got to do major reforms in the income tax. And some of those reforms in the income tax, getting rid of inefficient tax preferences, which are special interest tax breaks.
Loopholes is what they're called.
Tax loopholes, you said it. You know, when you get rid of those, it produces revenue. And when it produces revenue, you can use part of that revenue to actually simplify the tax code and lower the tax rates for everybody, as well as corporate tax rates.
And of course, Senator, those loopholes are there precisely because of their very powerful interest in lobbies that help put them there.
But they've gotten out of control. We had about 2 trillion of those tax loopholes when we passed the 1986 tax reform law. That has grown to 14 trillion over a 10-year period. There is more going out in these tax loopholes than there is coming in the individual income tax. So there's desperate cries for tax reform, and that, because of making the tax system so much simpler, so much more efficient, it'll crank up the engine. And as a result of the economic engine, you're going to get more revenue. But you know, there are people that say, oh, I'm not going to vote for anything that's got a tax that's going to increase more revenue, even in an income tax reform. So that's where you've got to break through and get people of goodwill to come together. Now,
I've got to ask you this,
yes,
though.
sir.
People of goodwill coming together.
Every senator I know is a good person. They just got to get out of their ideological and partisan boxes.
2012, though, is an election year, and I
makes
keep
it tougher.
reading, you know, and on the internet and reading speeches and watching them on television and so forth. And it seems like there are those in both parties who are saying the best thing that could happen to our party is for nothing to be done and to set up the issues for the election. I know you must feel that, and it's kind of disconcerting to people that would like to see something done because everyone, as you say, there's an urgency to get this done, is there not?
As a matter of fact, the people are suffering. So you ought to have people of goodwill coming together and stop paying attention to this presidential election. But you're right, there are people that's what they want to do. They think their particular point of view is of political advantage in this presidential election. But the fact is that 44 Republican and Democratic senators that I told you about, we're about to get 7 more. Then we're going to have a press conference. 51 senators, that's a majority of the U.S. Senate. And we're going to say we want the super committee to go big and to make some major, major reforms.
Let me ask you about another issue area that you have worked hard on your entire career that I can remember, certainly in the Senate. And it's an issue area of great concern to Floridians, and that's the environment and oil. What's the biggest lesson to be learned by the BP oil spill, in your judgment?
Here was a spill that was far away from the shores of Florida, and yet some oil did get to Florida beaches, and those pictures kept away the tourist for an entire tourist season, with people going bankrupt, mortgage foreclosures because they had lost their jobs, because the entire tourism industry, our guests that come because of our beautiful beaches, most of our beaches didn't have any oil, but people thought they had oil. Now, that's not even to speak of all the damage that was done out there to the critters, which is the livelihood of the fishermen and the oystermen, as well as the long-term effects on the Gulf and the health of the Gulf. We still don't know. I just talked to two university researchers. They're finding major changes in the gills of fish that are in the estuaries where there's a lot of oil down in the sediment. So there's a lot that we're going to learn what is the implication for the future. That all said, you know the reason that we have been able to keep oil rigs off of the coast of Florida?
What is that?
It's not just because of the environment or because of our $50 billion a year tourism industry. It's the fact that the largest testing and training area for the United States military is the Gulf of Mexico off of Florida. And that affects every one of those bases up there, and that affects the preparedness of our defense for our national security. And when you explain all of that, then that's why we've got all the chambers of commerce up and down the Gulf Coast that are now realizing, wait, we value those military bases. We value that the F-22 pilot training is being done in Tyndall because of the training area. We value that the new F-35 all pilot training is coming to Eglin in Fort Walton. And so you put a combination of all that together, add on top of it, there's no oil out there off of Florida. Guess where the oil is? It's where the sediments came down the Mississippi River for millions of years and settled down, and that's where the drilling is out there.
Nevertheless, do you anticipate that there could still be pressure for drilling in Florida Gulf waters and in the Everglades?
Well, I see the pressure to put it in the Gulf because it affects the bottom line of an oil company, because a lease has value even if you're not drilling that lease. For example, there are 37 million acres under lease in the Gulf of Mexico today. Only 7 of the 37 million is drilled. 30 million acres are under lease that have not been drilled. There's plenty of room to drill, and that's where the oil is. You don't need more leases, but they always want to expand because the additional leases. You know one thing that has lessened the pressure on this? We have the greatest gas find that has now been found, but it's onshore. It's from Louisiana all the way up to New York. It is the equivalent in natural gas reserves that the oil reserves in Saudi Arabia.
Only got a couple of minutes left. I can't end this interview without talking a little politics with you, Senator, because you're up for re-election to your third term. And first of all, I got to ask you just straightforwardly, how do you assess your chances for winning this election?
Well, the good Lord willing and the people willing. You know, I've always said that the best politics is just to try to do a good job. And I think people are pretty discerning, and they have a pretty good chance. And I think there's a fairly favorable attitude. But, you know, elections today, there are all kinds of twists and turns. But the election is well a year away. And so instead of me worrying about politics, what I need to be worrying about is just trying to do a good job as senator.
Do you believe that President Obama can again win Florida in 2012 like he did in 2008?
I do. And naturally, the economy is a huge drag on the president, and he's going to get the blame for the sad fact that the economy has not recovered like we had all hoped it would. But, you know, an election is a contrast of generally two people, unless there's a third-party candidate. And when they size up the president and look at, for example, his successes in the international arena, because of the economy, he hasn't even gotten any credit for all the things that he's done in bringing down Al-Qaeda and the successes that we've had elsewhere, like Libya. But I think that'll all become into focus as the American people start looking, and as Floridians start looking. Here's the president, and here's the alternative. Which do we want? If the economy's going in the right direction, then I think he has a good chance of winning Florida.
Senator, we'll have to leave it right there. We really appreciate your joining us.
It's a pleasure, Steve.